So you're probably aware of the famous split in 90s and 2000s hip-hop that pitted the cerebral, energetic, flashy tendencies of the East Coast against the elegant, intuitive, comfortable style of the West Coast. These two stylistic characterizations instantly made sense to Americans from across the country, pulling from our cultural understandings of the East Coast as crowded, lively, and dynamic, while the West Coast felt relaxed, non-judgmental, and nonchalant. As it turns out, this wasn't even the first time that a massively popular music genre developed the same split along the exact same aesthetic lines. So far on this channel, we've discussed the cultural explosion of bebop jazz and all of its subsequent styles on the East Coast. But today, we're moving to the temperate, sunny seasides of the West with Time Out by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, a neoclassical de-escalation of post-war anxiety, and a commercial hit the likes of which jazz had never seen before and would only see a handful of times again. Brubeck obtained classical training through his music teacher mother and through attending college, but his focus on jazz really took hold as he became a performer for the US military as part of his conscripted service during World War II. Unsurprisingly, Brubeck became a major proponent of third-stream jazz, which means a thorough integration of classical and jazz traditions. For Brubeck, this meant using unusual time signatures and spending more time on planned melodies, but improvised solos would still remain. While bebop was revolutionizing New York City, Los Angeles would take a much more relaxed approach to jazz, using less blues elements, slower tempos, and spending less time dedicated to improvisation. This style would become known as cool jazz, and Dave Brubeck would be one of its foremost practitioners. The emergence of cool jazz as a commercial juggernaut, along with the huge popularity of R&B, is what spurred the New York scene into reforming bebop into the much more accessible form called hard bop. As the title suggests, Time Out specifically focuses on using time signatures which weren't common to jazz, with songs often flowing into and out of those strange meters. But even the Dave Brubeck Quartet would struggle with improvising in these odd time signatures at times. And you can tell that a couple of these songs have choruses in the non-standard times but snap back to 4/4 for the improvised solos. The album's inspiration came from the band's tour as part of an exhibition of American culture on behalf of the State Department, and some of the time signatures found on the album were brought back from cultures that they interacted with on the tour, most notably in Turkey. The melodies of the song's main themes exhibit a classical grace and at times even a romantic era flair for the dramatic, sometimes only resembling jazz through their instrumentation, most specifically the drum kit and the walking bass lines. Especially the piano playing calls back to the high classical tradition, comprising a style which only briefly flirts with the ragtime tradition that comprises most jazz piano, before shifting back into those long, smooth, unswung melodic lines. This record's jazziest tendencies unsurprisingly appear in the solos, which do admittedly display an awareness of bebop innovations, with their extended lines, relative abstraction, and snappy turns. However, these solos go even beyond the reforms of hard bop in their thematic unity and aesthetic temperance, leaving these melodies to only barely hang on to their swing roots, and almost exclusively stick to singable, accessible lines. It's pretty easy for somebody with a bias towards bebop to look at something like Time Out and immediately find cynical reasons for displeasure. I mean, I could at least see where somebody would think this is a sellout move compared to the radical chaos of the Charlie Parker era. Of course, that person would be seemingly vindicated by the record's record-setting performance, the highest-selling album in jazz history at a time when jazz was on a general decline nationwide. Put more bluntly, Time Out saw a band led by a white man with a classically trained background, injecting a heavy dose of European high culture into jazz, and creating something that white Americans would feel comfortable displaying on shelves in their homes. However, all available accounts of Dave Brubeck really dispel this idea of cynicism. He blazed a trail by leading one of the first integrated acts in the history of the US military, at a time when combat regiments were still segregated. He would routinely decline well-paying gigs which had any intention of sidelining his black bandmates, placing dignity before money in an obvious and controversial way for the time. He even exhibited embarrassment for some of his success, oftentimes deflecting admirers to the work of Duke Ellington at any mention that Brubeck might be the greatest of the age. None of this goes to say that Brubeck was some kind of anti-racist hero, but he seems to just have been playing music that came authentically from his experiences at a time that really just worked commercially. But if you still find yourself wondering why this album sounds the way it does, we should dig deeper into that hip-hop metaphor from before. You see, the 80s saw a fork in the road in hip-hop production styles, with the scene's unanimous support for the sample-based approach of Public Enemy forking into two different kinds of implementation. The East Coast continued down its tradition of letting samples sit on the sidelines, leaving ample room for an ambitious vocalist to charge straight down the middle of the track. Look at some of the most influential boom bap artists like Nas and the Wu-Tang Clan, whose verses get quoted endlessly while their choruses mostly sit in the background. The West Coast, on the other hand, was making some of the greatest party bangers of all time, all mostly influenced by the groundbreaking production approach of Dr. Dre. Songs from Tupac and Snoop Dogg catalog get instantly recognized for their iconic choruses, most of which feature prominent uses of samples which take equal responsibility with the vocalist for the song's success. Just like in jazz, the East Coast's virtuosic extemporaneous soloist matches up against the West Coast's tightly orchestrated ensembles, both of which demonstrate different approaches to the same goal of generating stars and making hits. However, it's no surprise that, just like your average person could probably quote more West Coast hip-hop than East Coast hip-hop, West Coast jazz would mostly outsell East Coast jazz, off the back of its easy listening atmosphere and a less enigmatic compositional approach. So Brubeck wasn't a cynic, and he certainly wasn't a racist, though he certainly benefited from his race and his musical context. Brubeck was just a Californian with classical musical training and a genuine love for jazz, the type of right place, right time combination which instantly launched him into national stardom. None of this really answers the most obvious central question, however, a question which those of us across the country are increasingly being forced to ask. Why are Californians like this? There could be a million answers to this. The weather's nicer, the people are more spread out, the class structure is newer and less rigid. But I choose to believe that there is no real answer to this question, or rather, the answer is a non-answer. California just is. Cultures just have a way of forming spontaneously out of geographical, material, and socioeconomic conditions and then sticking in place. Just like how you could probably identify the cultural differences between the high school or college that you went to and a similar one just a couple miles down the road. So if you want to understand California, there's not really one simple set of facts or one concise story of history for you to know. You just need to listen to distinctive cultural production, like Time Out, and marvel at culture's ability to create the wild differences and distinctive beauty of bebop and cool jazz.